The black jet streaked across the sky at over 2,000 miles per hour, 3 times the speed of sound, flying so high that the curvature of the earth was visible to its pilots. Below, the fields of England rolled past in a blur. The radar stations of the Royal Air Force tracked the aircraft on their screens, watching it slice through British airspace like a knife through silk. The officers knew what it was. They knew where it came from. They knew it was American. And they did nothing to stop it. This wasn't negligence. It wasn't oversight. It was policy. The SR-71 Blackbird, the fastest air-breathing manned aircraft ever built, flew wherever it wanted, and the British, despite having one of the most sophisticated air defense systems in the world, chose not to intercept it. Not because they couldn't, but because they wouldn't. To understand why requires peeling back the layers of a relationship that was built on debt, on dependence, and on the cold calculus of geopolitical survival. The story begins not in the skies above Britain, but in the smoking ruins of 1945. The Second World War had ended. The Union Jack still flew over territories from Cairo to Calcutta. But the men in Whitehall knew the truth. The empire was a facade. Behind the monuments and the pageantry was an economy that had been gutted to pay for victory. Britain had won the war militarily, but it had lost everything else. Its gold was in American vaults. Its industries were obsolete. Its debts were crushing. And across the Atlantic, a new power had emerged, one that held the keys to Britain's survival. The United States didn't need colonies. It had something better. It had creditors' leverage through the mechanisms of Lend-Lease, through the post-war loans, through the quiet dismantling of the sterling area. America had acquired what empire builders had always sought: control without conquest, influence without occupation. Britain became dependent, not as a vassal state in the medieval sense, but as a junior partner in a relationship, where saying no carried consequences that no British government was willing to risk. By the time the SR-71 entered service in 1964, the relationship had crystallized into something the British called the special relationship, and everyone else called reality. Britain needed American nuclear weapons under NATO. It needed American loans to stabilize the pound. It needed American markets for its exports. It needed American intelligence to track Soviet submarines. The list of dependencies was long, and it was growing. The Americans, for their part, needed Britain as a forward base, an unsinkable aircraft carrier off the coast of Europe, a loyal voice in the United Nations Security Council, and a useful validator of American policy in the eyes of the world. But loyalty has a price, and that price is measured in sovereignty surrendered in small, quiet increments. The SR-71 was designed for one purpose: reconnaissance. It was built to fly over hostile territory, photograph military installations, intercept communications, and escape before enemy fighters could react. The Soviets hated it. They tried everything to bring it down. They fired surface-to-air missiles that exploded miles below it. They scrambled MiG-25 interceptors that strained their engines trying to reach its altitude. They never succeeded. The Blackbird was untouchable, but the SR-71 didn't just fly over the Soviet Union. It flew over Allied nations too, over Norway, over West Germany, over Japan, and over Britain. The aircraft operated from RAF Mildenhall, an American air base on British soil. Technically, it was a Royal Air Force station. In practice, it was an American colony. The Stars and Stripes flew alongside the Union Jack, and the command structure answered to the Pentagon, not to Parliament. When the SR-71 took off from Mildenhall, it didn't file a flight plan with British air traffic control. It didn't ask permission to enter British airspace. It simply flew. And the British radar operators watched it go. The question isn't whether Britain could have intercepted the SR-71. The question is why they never tried. And the answer lies in a series of decisions made not in the moment, but in the decades leading up to that moment, decisions that traded short-term survival for long-term autonomy. Start with the geography. Britain is a small island with a crowded sky. Every inch of airspace is monitored. The Royal Air Force operated a network of radar stations and quick reaction alert bases designed to intercept Soviet bombers that might approach across the North Sea. British fighters, typically English Electric Lightning interceptors in the 1960s and 70s, could scramble in minutes. They were fast, well-armed, and flown by highly trained pilots. In theory, they could challenge any aircraft in British airspace. But theory and practice are separated by politics. The SR-71 wasn't an unknown intruder. It was an Allied aircraft operating from an Allied base under the umbrella of NATO. To scramble fighters to intercept it would be to treat it as hostile. That would require a political decision at the highest levels of government. And no British government was willing to make that decision, because the implications were too dangerous to contemplate. Imagine the scene. A British Lightning pulls alongside the Blackbird at 60,000 feet, assuming it could even reach that altitude, which was doubtful. The British pilot radios the American crew, demanding they identify themselves and land. The Americans ignore him. What happens next? Does the British pilot fire a warning shot? Does he lock his radar on the American aircraft? Does he threaten to shoot it down? And if he does, what then? The moment a British fighter threatened an American reconnaissance aircraft, the entire architecture of the alliance would be thrown into question. The Americans would demand an explanation. They would want to know if this was policy or the action of a rogue pilot. If it was policy, they would ask why Britain was treating its most important ally as a potential adversary. The diplomatic fallout would be immediate and severe, and Britain had far more to lose in such a confrontation than the United States. In the 1960s, Britain was still struggling to stabilize its economy after the disasters of the late 1940s. The pound had been devalued. The empire was dissolving. The Suez Crisis of 1956 had already demonstrated the limits of British power when the Americans, by refusing to support the pound during the crisis, had forced Britain to abandon a military operation in the middle of its execution. The lesson was clear. Britain could act independently only as long as America allowed it to. The SR-71 became a symbol of that reality. It flew through British airspace not because it was invisible or unstoppable, though it was both, but because it operated under an implicit understanding that had never been written down and never needed to be. The understanding was this: America would do what it needed to do to counter the Soviet Union, and Britain would not interfere. In exchange, Britain would remain under the American nuclear umbrella, would continue to receive intelligence sharing, and would retain a voice, however diminished, in the decisions that shaped the Western alliance. This wasn't a conspiracy, it was a transaction. Britain traded airspace sovereignty for security guarantees. It was a rational choice made by rational people who understood that their nation no longer had the wealth or the power to stand alone. The age of British independence had ended in the frozen winter of 1947, when the pound became convertible and the reserves evaporated in 5 weeks. Everything that followed was an adaptation to that new reality. But the presence of the SR-71 over Britain carried a deeper significance. It was a reminder that the bases on British soil were not British bases hosting Americans. They were American bases on British territory. RAF Mildenhall, RAF Lakenheath, RAF Fairford. These installations were leased to the United States under agreements that gave the Americans extraordinary autonomy. The Pentagon controlled the runways, the hangars, and the weapons stored there. British officials had limited oversight and no veto power over American operations. During the Cold War, those bases housed nuclear-armed bombers, fighter bombers loaded with tactical nuclear weapons, and reconnaissance aircraft like the SR-71. The British government knew what was there, more or less, but it didn't control it. When American presidents ordered strikes or deployments, the aircraft took off from British soil without requiring approval from the British Prime Minister. This was the price of the special relationship. Britain provided the real estate. America provided the strategy. The SR-71 flights were just the most visible manifestation of this arrangement. The Blackbird flew high enough to be seen, or at least tracked. But there were other operations that remained hidden. Signals intelligence was gathered from British soil and shared selectively with British agencies. Submarine operations were coordinated through joint command centers where American admirals made the final decisions. Nuclear targeting plans included Soviet cities that would be struck by missiles launched from bases in Britain, decisions that would make Britain a priority target in any nuclear exchange. Yet those targeting decisions were made in Omaha, not London. The British public, for the most part, didn't know the details. They knew there were American bases. They saw the occasional protests outside the gates. But the full extent of the integration, the degree to which British defense policy had been subordinated to American strategic priorities, was classified. The government maintained the fiction of sovereignty, of partnership between equals. The reality was something closer to a franchise operation. Britain provided the location, America provided the menu. And yet, this arrangement worked. For all its humiliations, for all its surrenders of autonomy, the British government concluded that the alternatives were worse. Trying to build an independent defense capability would have bankrupted the country. Trying to develop an independent nuclear deterrent, which Britain did attempt, resulted in weapons that were dependent on American delivery systems and American targeting data. Trying to operate outside the American orbit would have left Britain isolated, vulnerable, and irrelevant in a world increasingly defined by the superpower competition between Washington and Moscow. So the SR-71 flew. It flew missions over the Baltic, monitoring Soviet naval activity. It flew missions along the Norwegian coast, tracking submarine deployments, and it flew through British airspace on its way to and from those missions. The RAF tracked it, the British government knew about it, and no one gave the order to intercept because everyone understood that such an order would be the beginning of a crisis that Britain could not afford. There were moments when the arrangement was tested. In the 1980s, when American F-111 bombers took off from British bases to strike Libya, the British government was informed hours before the attack, not consulted. The The bombers used British airspace and British bases for an operation that the British had no part in planning and limited ability to stop. The opposition party in Parliament demanded answers. The Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher, defended the decision, arguing that Britain's security depended on American support and that allies must stand together. The critics called it subservience. The government called it realism. The SR-71 was retired in 1998. By then, satellites had taken over most reconnaissance missions, and the cost of operating the Blackbird had become prohibitive. But the questions it raised about sovereignty, about alliance, and about the true nature of the Anglo-American relationship remain unanswered, or perhaps they have been answered through decades of acquiescence. Britain chose not to intercept the SR-71 for the same reason it chose not to challenge American policy in dozens of other areas. It had lost the war for economic independence in 1947. It had lost the illusion of military parity at Suez in 1956. By the time the Blackbird entered service, the British government had accepted its role in a hierarchy that it no longer controlled. The special relationship was special only in the sense that Britain was allowed to pretend it still mattered. Sovereignty is not a switch that gets turned off. It's a commodity that gets sold in pieces, traded for loans, for security guarantees, for access to markets and intelligence. Britain sold its sovereignty incrementally, transaction by transaction, crisis by crisis, until the idea of scrambling fighters to challenge an American aircraft became unthinkable, not because of the capabilities involved, but because of the consequences that would follow. The SR-71 flew through British airspace not as a trespasser, but as a landlord inspecting property. The British had leased their skies to the Americans in the same way they had leased their bases, their nuclear policy, and their strategic independence. They did so because the alternative, standing alone, was more terrifying than standing aside. In the cold logic of geopolitics, there are no friendships, there are only interests and leverage. The United States had both. Britain had neither. The black jet that streaked across the English countryside at 3 times the speed of sound was not a symbol of alliance. It was a reminder of debt, of dependency, and of the price that nations pay when they can no longer afford to say no. The British chose not to intercept the SR-71 because by the time it flew, they had already surrendered the right to choose.